Steve Kemper, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So you wrote the biography of I'm going to go out there and say he's quite truly the real life most interesting man in the world. His name is Frederick Russell Burnham. He was a famous scout, prospector. I mean, this guy did it all. And we're going to get into his exploits that he did during his life. But let's start from the beginning, because his life was interesting from the very beginning. He was born in the Minnesota frontier, and figuratively and literally, he was born in fire. Can you tell us a little about Burnham's early years in the Minnesota frontier and how his experience with the Sioux Native Americans in particular formed the foundation for the rest of his life?
Sure. He was the son of a preacher man. Who was a very educated guy who took a lot of higher education from the East and went to a Winnebago Indian reservation on the Minnesota frontier, and that's where Frederick was born. On his timing, as usual, was impeccable for trouble. A year and a half after he was born, the Dakota Sioux started a war when a lot of the men were away at our Civil War. And one of the consequences was that they attacked Burnham's homestead. Burnham's father was away trying to get some lead to melt down for bullets. So Burnham's mother was there with him, and she saw them coming, and she picked him up and ran, and she realized, if I keep running with this baby, they'll catch us both and kill us both. So she stuffed him in a shock of green corn stalks and kept running and told him not to move. Next day she came back, her homestead was burnt down. Corn stalks are scorched, and she parched them in there. Lying there quietly is her son, Frederick Russell Burnham. So that was his introduction to frontier life and Indian warfare.
And beyond that initial introduction, did he encounter the Sioux later on in his childhood, or did he, I guess at one point, his family moved to California?
Well, the Sioux kicked the settlers in Minnesota, and it really was a frontier. It was it's just at the edge of the frontier. It was turning into something else by the time Frederick was born. They kicked all the Sioux out and killed some of them, but made the rest go to reservations. So there were no legal Sioux there for Frederick's early childhood, but there were plenty of other Indians around, and he played with them. All the children did. And that's partly where he started his interest in woodcraft and Indian ways. And you're right, then they moved to California because his father got sick, and they wanted to go to a new place, a warmer place, in hopes that it would help his health. It didn't. And he died when Frederick was 12. But Frederick, the mother and Frederick's younger brother decided to go back to Iowa because they had no means of making a living. Fred said at age 12, "No, I'm going to stay. I'm going to be fine on my own here," and that's what he did.
Yeah, so that was amazing. Like and the reason he stayed behind because he wanted to pay off his mother's debt, because I guess she had to borrow some money to get back to Iowa because their family was destitute. So here's this 12-year-old kid thinking, like, I got to take on my family's obligations, and so he started doing these odd jobs around California, and then it ended up traveling around the Southwest. And this is the time when the Southwest was the Wild West. What kind of work did Frederick do during this time, and what sort of skills did he acquire with the jobs that he did that helped him later on in his career as a scout?
Well, he started at age 12 as a messenger for Western Union Telegram. He delivered telegrams from the inner city of the Pueblo, and Los Angeles was really small at that time. It was less than 10,000 people. And he did that 16 hours a day, writing, delivering telegrams to ranches and villages outside of the Pueblo. He got tired of that because it was sort of regimented, and he became a freelance hunter for freighters camps in the mountains of California. The freighters were hauling silver and lead bullion from the mines in the mountains of California to Los Angeles, which became the ornaments of the Gilded Age eventually. And those guys who were on the wagons needed to eat, and Frederick learned he was a good shot, and he was a horseman, and so he earned a living by hunting for supplying meat to these camps. And in the meantime, he also met some of the old frontiersmen, some of the old Indian fighters from earlier campaigns, and began picking their brains about how to read tracks, how to follow a horse, how to know what the size of someone that you're tracking, the number in their party, how to avoid being picked off and killed by someone who is looking for you. You know, all these skills you began to pick up as a youth in the Southwest.
Yeah, that was amazing. He had this great apprenticeship during the Southwest period. And like, it was interesting. Like, did he seek these mountain men out, or did he just somehow come across them and he impressed these mountain men and they took him under his wing?
Well, my impression is that he sought them out. That he had decided in Minnesota that he wanted to be a scout. He knew that from a young age, and the people who were the repositories of this knowledge were, as you can imagine, kind of gruff, rough old timers who didn't have a lot of patience for teenagers who wanted to ask a lot of questions. So he basically had to hang around until they saw that he was serious and that he had some talent, and that they couldn't scare him off. And that's how he learned. I mean, for Burnham, scouting was, I suppose, romantic in some ways, but essentially it was a very hard discipline that you had to practice every day and learn. A writer later on referred to him as the Paderewski of scouting, because he had devoted so much time, discipline, and work to doing the things that he could do out in the wild.
Yeah, I mean, his training was intense. I mean, he was almost like a monastic warrior with some of the, like, he would make himself, like, I guess one of the things he did, he'd prick himself with pins so he could learn how to withstand pain.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah. He thought that a good scout had to be able to still function when he was exhausted, very thirsty, very hungry, and alone for long periods of time, which for Burnham, he said that was the hardest part, because your mind would start to play tricks on you. You know, you can, as we all know, if you're alone too much, you become weird. So there's a fine line in between scouting and staying alert, and scouting as a kind of psychopathology.
right.
And he knew he had to tread that line.
And you said that his desire to become a scout, it was sort of based on, there were some romantic notions to it, because I guess Burnham, like a lot of young boys growing up in Victorian England and America, like, he read and devoured these adventure books written at the time. And these are the same books like Teddy Roosevelt read as a boy, Winston Churchill. Can you tell us a little bit about this adventure genre of Victorian, you know, your Anglo world, I guess we'll say, that inspired Burnham and a lot of other young men to become adventurers?
Yeah, you know, it's a symptom of both the expansion west and the early symptoms of its ending, because that's when you become nostalgic and romantic about these things. But these books became very, very popular in the 1860s, and most of them were highly embroidered biographies of frontier heroes such as Davy Crockett, Daniel Boone, Kit Carson. And this was also the decade and the era when dime novels became available and everywhere, and they were inexpensive, and they had wide distribution, and these were just unbelievable fantasies with the heroes had names like Deadwood Dick and Mustang Sam, and the titles were things like The Scalp Hunters, or Search for a White Buffalo, or, you know, Steel Coat the Apache Terror. That's how, and of course a boy's going to eat this stuff up. I did when I was a kid. I loved those old frontier stories and things. And so Burnham was reading these as a child in Minnesota and thinking, like any kid would, wow, I would love to be out there with the Apache Terror and the White Buffalo and Deadwood Dick. And so there's the romantic side of this, and then you get out there and you realize it's the Wild West. It's Indians who want to kill you. It's rough manners, trying to scratch a living, most people failing. There's a lot of alcoholism. And none of this stuff appeared in the books.
Right. And also the scouts in the books often appear to be sort of, and Burnham even talked about this in his writings, that, you know, as a child he read about these scouts in the Wild West, that they just kind of solve things sort of like Sherlock Holmes, right? But he said actually it's the job of a scout's really tedious and boring and monotonous.
Yeah, because you're sitting on a rock waiting for something to show up or move or reveal itself so that you can report back. It's not, it's I guess it's sort of, and you have to stay constantly alert because somebody's looking for you too to move and find out what you're doing. And the supplies that you have to take. It's all about preparation, patience, being able to bear all these hardships and bring back information that's valuable to your commander. And it's not for everybody.
Yeah, Burnham had that drive. And, speaking of, he read these stories about the Apache Wars. Like, Burnham actually got involved in some of the Apache conflict that was going on in the Southwest, as well as this feud that I had no idea that happened during the Wild West that was bigger than the Hatfield and the McCoys. Can you tell us a little bit about Burnham's involvement with not only the Apaches, but this family feud that was going on?
Sure. It's really because we still haven't even gotten him out of his teen years yet.
Right. He's still a teenager. This is the crazy thing. He's still a teenager, and he's done all this stuff.
Yeah. Well, the Tonto Basin feud it's the bloodiest feud in U.S. history, and it was a range war essentially between sheepmen and cattlemen in this isolated part of Arizona, which was the most isolated part of America at that time. It was the wildest part. It was the last part that was settled. It was the last state let into the Union because it was so wild. And that's where the Apaches were, too. The Chiricahua and the White Mountain Apaches, this was their stronghold as well. So it was very volatile. The Tonto Basin feud, and there were two main families, and all the men on both sides were killed except for the one last guy who killed the last guy on the other side. And got away with it. Went to trial twice, but got off because he had good lawyers. He was funded by the wealthy sheepmen. So and Burnham was associated with this. He got sucked into it, as everybody did in Central Arizona, because you either were for one side or the other, or you had to have allies, or you were going to get killed. And Burnham was forced to choose, and he did. And he was on the wrong side, and he was chased a few times, I guess. And there was a price on his head, but he got away and lived. So there's that. And then the Apaches, yeah, he admired the Apaches very much. They were for him the exemplars of scouting because they had iron bodies, they had iron wills, and they knew everything about their environment. They could survive in any conditions. They could disappear. As George Crook, who was the best fighter against them, he called them the tigers of the human species because they were such great guerrilla fighters. And Burnham admired them very much, even though he fought them. This was one of the things about him. His attitudes were based upon the perspective from the saddle, not from the armchair. And I try to keep that in mind when he's doing some of the things and saying some of the things about Native people in his life.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the sort of the contradictions that he had within him. You talk about this, he's a guy filled with contradictions, but like a lot of 19th century Americans, he had these ideas about native people and white people, like the superiority of the white race. But at the same time, he respected not only Native Americans, but he went over to Africa. There's a lot he admired about the Native Africans there in colonial Africa. But at the same time, he had this disdain for them as well.
Yeah.
And this was something shared that it wasn't just him. It was like Winston Churchill, Theodore Roosevelt even had sort of the same attitudes, sort of this mixture of disdain and admiration.
Yeah. Burnham, he made strong choices. I mean, he admired the Apaches. Other Indians he did not care for very much. He admired the Apaches because of their military culture and their absolute devotion to physical fitness, self-reliance, self-discipline, war, hunting, camouflage, scouting. Other Indians weren't that way, and so he didn't care much for them. And Africa's the same thing. The Ndebele tribe he admired very much because it was a warrior culture. They were incredibly brave. They were incredibly fit, devoted to mastery of their art, which was war. Other tribes he didn't care for much, but he thought he was on the progressive side of history, so it didn't matter what qualities these other peoples had, because they were inevitably, in his view, going to going to be churned up by the progress of the white race, which was the march of history, which was inevitable, and he was glad to be doing his bit to make it happen. So he was a racist, but he was also a progressive, and that's it's not a contradiction in the minds of people like Roosevelt, Churchill, and Burnham.
Right. I think it's something. It's a mentality that's really hard for modern Americans to understand. But I think you did a good job explaining the mentality, that why they would have that sort of mentality. So this is his time in the desert Southwest. But what's interesting too, while he's doing all this scouting in the Southwest, he caught gold fever, and this is something that would chase him the rest of his life. So how did his scouting and prospecting work in tandem with each other?
That's a good question. Well, he was always after money as well. I mean,
he was always after money. He reminded me of Jack London a little bit. Jack London was always after money. Like, the reason why he wrote all these books was just so he could have money.
Yeah, well, he was up there in the Klondike. Burnham doesn't. He mentions him, I believe, but I don't know if they actually knew each other when Burnham got up there. But you're right, Burnham. He wanted action and he wanted income, and those two things often drew him to frontiers, because that's where you could find the action, and you might find a bonanza because you were one of the first ones in. It hadn't been raked over yet. So I think there's that excitement, and there's also the risk, of course, of both scouting and mining. You're taking a huge risk. You're going into unknown territory. You don't know what you're going to find. You don't know if it's going to be good fortune or failure. Both of them require knowledge of landscape and being able to read it for signs of what should and shouldn't be there. You have to know how to spot the signs of gold or silver if you're going to be a miner, and then you have to be able to track those, because usually they appear as what's called float, just loose stones that have flakes of gold or veins of silver in them, and then you have to figure out, where did this come from? You have to track it back to the vein where it eroded from, or the lode where it came from, and see if there really was anything there, or if it's just going to be another empty hole. So I guess there's some similarities between the two things.
Right. So during this time, he started, I guess, was he making his own claims during this time he was scouting in the Southwest?
Well, they were sort of, he did one and then he did the other. He alternated. He would need money, so he'd have to go into the desert to look for things that would give him a paycheck. Sometimes that was as a hunter for mining camps, and sometimes it was as a prospector. And then if a war broke out, an Apache uprising occurred, he would get himself hired on as someone who could help do that. And he was still very young when the last Apache campaigns were held, but he learned from some of those old scouts for Crook, and kept mastering and learning and developing that. And that's what he took to Africa with him when he finally felt like the West was getting too hemmed in and he had to go someplace new.
Right. And so he's done this, like, he's like still in his 20s, right? Like early 20s. What's interesting though, this is a guy who was filled with wanderlust, desired action, but the guy still got married. And he was married to the same woman his entire life. Can you tell us a little about his wife, Blanche, and the type of woman she was, and why she put up with Burnham? Because it seemed like she liked that he was so action oriented, and then he took her on these adventures, but at the same time you could tell in her diary and her letters, like, she just wanted to settle down. So why did she stay with Burnham for their entire life?
Well, that's a really good question, and the only answer is the completely illogical one: love. It makes people do crazy things. They really loved each other. This is a love story. There's no doubt about it. And she liked the excitement that she brought to his life. She wanted to travel with him. I don't think she wanted to settle down so much as she just wanted to be with him. And because she went with him all over the globe, in some pretty rough places, and liked it. And in fact, she got impatient in London, just like he did, and said, "I want you to take me to Patagonia. Let's get out of here and go, do something remote." But often Burnham was away because these places were often no place for women, or he was at war, and that was no place for women at the time. And so she pined for him, and he pined for her too, but it didn't stop him from going. And that's one of the contradictions in him, I think. Their letters are filled with longing for each other, romantic love, all the way to the end. It's an amazing thing, and they did finally, when Burnham was in his 60s, get to start spending their time together.
Okay, so he gets married, early 20s, decides to fulfill his childhood dream of going to Africa because things in the Wild West were just not wild enough for him. And again, so it seemed like in Africa, Burnham had two things going at the same time. He had this scouting and prospecting going on at the same time. Let's talk about his scouting first. Who was he scouting for, and how did he? I think you're gonna have to like dig in deep into colonial African history for us, because this was completely new to me when I read your book. I mean, who was he working for down in southern Africa?
Well, it was the British South Africa Company, which had what they called a chartered company. The British government had given a charter to the British South Africa Company to settle and mine a vast section of Africa, which is these days it's known as Rhodesia, and it encompasses some of the other countries near Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe. So Burnham wanted to go there because this was an exciting new frontier. He wanted to help the white race progress, and he wanted to make money. He wanted to prospect. Southern Africa had made millionaires of a number of people because of the diamonds that were coming out of South Africa, and the gold, the famous Rand, and the famous diamond mines of De Beers. They were booming, and Burnham thought, I want some of that. So he goes over there for that, and just as he reaches the settlement, and there were only two little forts at the time in this part of Africa. Just as he reaches there, war breaks out with the natives. So instead of becoming a prospector, he has to become a scout. And he and another American and a Canadian were the three main scouts for the settlers, the militia that went to war against this very powerful kingdom of black warriors, the Ndebele tribe. And they won because they had a gun that could mow down the natives. It's one of those things where a few hundred people can dominate thousands because of artillery, guns, germs, and steel.
Yeah, and so he had these skirmishes with the natives, but then there's these fights and wars with the Boers. Can you tell us a little bit about the Boer Wars and Burnham's involvement with that?
Sure. Let me just a little bit more background. They won that first war against the natives. Another war broke out against the natives. The natives rebelled eventually, naturally, to try to take back their land. And then Burnham went to the Klondike. And then when he's in the Klondike, the Boer War broke out in southern Africa. And the British were getting their behinds handed to them by the Boers, who were terrific guerrilla fighters because they knew the landscape. They'd been there for a long time. The British were arrogant. They marched in solid blocks of lines that were easy to mow down, and they had no intelligence. They didn't have military intelligence. Which I guess it's sort of it's the same thing as intelligence in war, isn't it? You have to have one, or you don't have the other. And so the commander of the British troops, Lord Roberts, heard from one of his officers, the best scout I ever had was this American guy named Burnham, and I think he's in the Klondike. Let's see if we can find him. So Lord Roberts sends a telegram, and it gets to Skagway. Burnham he gets it. He comes home and tells Blanche, we're leaving in 2 hours. I've been appointed chief of scouts for the British Army in southern Africa. So that's how he got involved in the Boer War, and that's where he became really famous. He'd done some exploits before that in the famous events in the Native Wars, but the Boer War is what really brought him to world attention and kept him there, because he was behind the enemy lines over 100 times. He was always doing things that were extraordinary and surviving them. He got captured, he escaped, and then he was blowing up railroads and that sort of thing. So he became very well known. He was in the London papers a lot. that time.
Yeah, not just London. I mean, it also made its way over to America in the New York Times. Like his exploits would be there too.
Yeah, yep. He was well known, but of course, most Americans were for the Boers in that war, not the British, and so he was well known, but he was not as appreciated as he was in Britain, I guess you could say, by some people.
Right. And so for those who aren't familiar with the Boer War, the Boers were, I guess, Dutch settlers that had settled there first in southern Africa. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Right. So it was like Europeans
they'd
fighting Europeans.
Yeah, it was the white man's war, they called it, and of course a lot of black people had to pay the price for the white man's war, but it was a horrible, horrible war. It was very costly to the British. It was terrifically costly to the Boers, who were the equivalent of the Apaches in some ways, a small group of mobile guerrilla fighters taking on an empire. And they held the British at bay for years and years, and the British, boy, it drained them. It was like their Vietnam, and it also was the beginning of concentration camps and of trench warfare. It was things that the 20th century, adopted and were horrified by in the First World War, but it happened first in the Boer War.
Right. And so, I mean, yeah, Burnham gained like world fame. Like, I guess after the Boer War, like him and his wife, they went up to London and like they had to entertain all these, dignitaries. And I think even like Queen Victoria wanted to meet with him, but like she had to cancel for some reason.
Yeah, she got sick, and that's why she canceled. But Burnham was awarded the Distinguished Service Order, which is the highest medal that a foreigner can receive in Britain, and he received that from King Edward VII because of his actions in the Boer War.
So while this was going on, while he, in between these, I guess, times as scout when he's warring, he's also doing prospecting in Africa. How did his prospecting in Africa turn out, or was that sort of a bust?
Well, I guess it depends how you look at it. He discovered many very wealthy veins of and reefs, they're called, of gold, veins of copper. A lake of sodium carbonate that he thought all these things were going to be his fortune. Because they were so fabulously wealthy and he was partners. He never wanted to just be on the payroll. He wanted to have a percentage because he was an entrepreneur and a risk taker. And then things kept getting in the way. Sometimes another war would crop up so that you couldn't get to the veins, or his partners would run out of money and they wouldn't develop the veins, or his partners would screw him so he couldn't get the money that he deserved to get. It's really incredible how tantalizing so many of these things were that he did the work for and then never cashed in on. But he did do well enough to save enough money so that his children could be educated and so that he could take care of Blanche for the rest of her life, and Blanche's parents and his own mother. So he sent quite a bit of money back to the U.S. Just before the Boer War. He had enough mining interest and land interest to do that, but he wasn't fabulously wealthy. He just was keeping his family above poverty. He knew that they would never have to live in poverty. Right. Which is not the same thing as being wealthy.
Right. But despite kind of being above poverty, he was world famous.
Yeah, that was his military stuff. But that also made him attractive because he was successful at finding these mineral deposits. He was a mineral explorer. He was hired by syndicates to explore other places in Africa, the Gold Coast of Africa on the west coast, which is Ghana. We call it Ghana now. He led an expedition there that was very successful in terms of gold, but he never saw much money from that at all. And also in British East Africa, which is now Kenya, and he found this soda lake, and he also a lot of rich agricultural land, and he saw nothing from either of those things either.
So let's kind of do a recap here of this guy's life, because we've only skimmed the surface. But so almost got burnt by Sioux during the Sioux War in Minnesota. Goes to California as a 12-year-old boy, by himself, works for Western Union delivering telegrams, meets mountain men, gets apprenticed by mountain men during his teenage years. Late teenage years, early 20s, he's taking part in one of the biggest feuds in American history, fights Apaches, gets married, goes to Africa, is a scout in these native wars for this charter company. Then he goes to the Klondike to take part in the gold rush that was going on there. Comes back to be a scout during the Boer War, and all the while in Africa he is prospecting, buying property, etc. Man, that's a lot. And he became world famous. And this is like by the time he's like, I guess his 40s, right?
Yeah, I think he's his late 30s in the Boer War. Yeah.
Yeah. And what's crazy too, so okay, this guy had some crazy adventures, but during his life, he rubs shoulders with some of the most influential people in the world during the late 19th and 20th century. Who are some of the famous men that Burnham, this humble American scout from the Wild West, who are some of these men that he called friend?
Well, I guess for starters, it'd be Cecil Rhodes, who was the main partner in the British South Africa Company, who had this vision for Southern Africa as the next great outpost of British civilization. And he became friends with Rhodes and even business partners with Rhodes. They were a lot alike in some ways, risk takers. The odds didn't matter. The vision is what mattered. So he knew Rhodes.
And Rhodes is the guy, the Rhodes Scholar is named after him, right?
That's right. Rhodes was one of the wealthiest men in the world at the time that Burnham met him, but he didn't care much about the trappings of wealth. He was more interested in this vision that he had of what to do within Africa and how to turn it into this gigantic extension of British civilization. He's extraordinary. That's and Rhodesia, of course, was named after Rhodes after the native wars, and then Rhodes funded what became the Rhodes Scholarship because he also was interested in preserving some of the ruins that he found in Africa. Of course, they didn't believe that the natives had built them. They thought that maybe Phoenicians had come down and done it. In keeping with the racial attitudes of the day, this couldn't possibly be a product of native culture, and it was, of course. So he knew Rhodes. He knew Winston Churchill because of the Boer War. They were shipmates on the way back when Burnham, who had been severely wounded while he was blowing up a railroad and had to crawl back to British lines he cut up the canvas gunpowder sacks and put them on his hands and knees so he could crawl back to the British lines. They were on the same boat back to Britain. Churchill had just escaped from the Pretoria jail, which was a famous episode in his life. They became friends. He was good friends with H. Rider Haggard, who was one of the most popular novelists of the day. He wrote things like She and King Solomon's Mines, and he said about Burnham, in real life, he's more interesting than any of my heroes of romance, which is quite a compliment. And then, of course, Roosevelt. He met Roosevelt when Teddy Roosevelt was police commissioner of New York, and they became good friends. Roosevelt asked him to become a Rough Rider, but Burnham at the time was on the edge of the Yukon River waiting for the ice to break up so he could go down the river to the gold, so he couldn't do it. And later on, TR asked Burnham to be one of 18 officers for his volunteer corps that was going to go to World War I, but Woodrow Wilson vetoed that idea because he didn't want Roosevelt to get any more publicity. So he was very good friends with him all his life. And some of the big capitalists of the day, John Hayes Hammond, the Guggenheims, Harry Payne Whitney, Edward Harriman, the railroad baron, these were people that Burnham was in partnership with various times. He knew a lot of well-known people, and they all admired him. TR, one mutual friend of he and TR said that Burnham was the only man who could turn TR into a listener, which is a pretty high compliment.
Yeah, and I mean, it's amazing. Like he sounds like, it sounds like a story. Like someone wrote a story, like it's fiction, right, from the 19th century. Like you'd see some movie, like The Extraordinary League of Gentlemen. Like this was like Burnham was like the real life most interesting man in the world.
Yeah, and his life was so incredible that some people have called him a liar, by the way, and have said that he made stuff up. And so this was, of course, you can imagine I'm a reporter. This was pretty disturbing to me when I came across these allegations about some of the key events in Burnham's life. So I looked into this pretty hard, and I must say that I found the evidence thin to non-existent that he was a liar, that he made anything up. He did all this stuff there, and a lot of it is corroborated by contemporary accounts. His letters to all sorts of people corroborate things that he was called a liar about. I mean, it is extraordinary. It is almost unbelievable that he did all these things, but he did.
Yeah, and he was also friends with Lord Baden-Powell, the founder of the Boy Scout movement. And this is kind of interesting. Burnham actually had an influence on the scouting program. Can you specifically talk about some of the insights or influence that Burnham provided Baden-Powell with when he started the scouting program?
Yeah, sure. He got to know Baden-Powell in Rhodesia during the Second Matabele War. Baden-Powell was an officer assigned there, and the two of them went on at least one long scout together. Burnham appears in Baden-Powell's book about the uprising, and he was struck by how much Burnham could discern by just looking at what was around him. And this meshed with Baden-Powell's worry that the boys of Britain were losing the masculine values that he associated with an outdoor life: self-sufficiency, resourcefulness, knowledge of nature, physical toughness, mental toughness. He thought that these things should be preserved, and he wanted to teach them to boys through some sort of organization. And he talked about this with Burnham, and Burnham said that's a great idea. You should do that. And so eventually, as we know, Baden-Powell founded the Boy Scouts and other influence, and they became really good friends. And Baden-Powell would, for decades, would write letters picking Burnham's brain about woodcraft and how to do things in the woods and how to tell things and read nature and everything. Baden-Powell also, by the way, was an ardent advocate of scouting in the military, and because he predicted that since the British had turned their backs on scouting, it was going to be disastrous militarily, and that's exactly what happened in the Boer War. Anyway, to get back to Burnham, Baden-Powell came to Southern Africa with the usual regalia of the British officer: the pith helmet, the red coat. And Burnham said, "You need to take that off if we're going scouting because you look like a target." So he adopted Burnham's stiff-brimmed brown Stetson hat and neckerchief. And of course, those two things became the main emblems of the Boy Scout uniform in later years.
There you go.
And I kind of wonder if the motto came from Burnham too. I have no proof of it, but "Be prepared" was certainly one of Burnham's mantras, and I wonder if he got that from Burnham.
Yeah, I'm curious if that happened too. So yeah, Burnham lived a fascinating life. I'm curious, why do so few people know about Burnham today, despite being world famous and all the stuff that he did during his lifetime?
Well, that's the vagaries of history and fame. There's not a real answer that I've come up with about that. He's just burned brightly and disappeared. He didn't do anything that was extraordinary that made him stand out as a historical, monumental figure. He just did his job and seemed to be everywhere the action was. And he knew a lot of famous people, but I don't know. He definitely, I think, he should be at least as well known as Kit Carson and some of the other famous frontier heroes that we have. I think partly that's partly the answer. He was a scout at a time when those skills were not in demand or valued as much. He came after the myth of the scout. He was the real deal, but he was after it, and so he missed the mythology. I'm just nattering on now. I don't really know why.
I think it's a good theory. I think it's a really good theory. How did Burnham spend his twilight years? Did he still have that itch for adventure even when he was 60, 70, 80 years old?
Yeah, I don't think he ever lost that. He he became wealthy finally. We've left out Mexico, by the way. We left out Mexico.
Yeah, he went down to Mexico.
Yeah, he got mixed up in the Mexican Revolution, and at one point he probably helped save President McKinley from being assassinated. That's another, you know.
He was a bodyguard for like that big meeting between Diaz and McKinley at Juarez in El Paso.
Yeah. So he did that, but anyway, in his later years, he became he started looking into oil. He became a partner with some wealthy people who trusted him to become a scout for oil, and he said, we need to dig at this place. Basically, it was based almost right outside downtown Los Angeles, and I don't know if you've ever seen photos of Los Angeles in the 20s and the 30s, but there are derricks everywhere. You could see them from any place in Los Angeles, and a lot of people had drilled there already, and so his backers said, no, I don't want to do it, and Burnham said, I know it's there. They drilled. It became one of the most productive wells in California, made Burnham a millionaire, and that was in his 60s. Finally, he got his bonanza in his boyhood home. I love the symmetry of it. Right. But he lived to be 86, and he died in bed in his sleep, which doesn't seem possible for a man who lived the life that he did. You know, from scalps on the frontier to the atomic bomb. But that's what he did.
Yeah, and like even in his 70s, he almost had like a brush with death. Like there was a car accident that he tumbled down a mountain in the Hollywood Hills.
Yeah, he was run off the road and spent. The car was pancaked. I mean, you couldn't kill the guy. Right. He just would not die. So, yeah, he survived that, like many other things, and got married very late in life to his secretary. His wife Blanche died, and he married another woman when he was in his early 80s. And I think his zest for life never diminished.
Yeah, I mean, what was driving Burnham this entire time? I mean, like, was it just like this romance, or he just had this itch for novelty? Was it money, fame? And why did he put himself in these dangerous areas over and over again?
Well, I guess the cheap, simple explanation we'd call him an adrenaline junkie these days. He had to be where the action was. He wanted to be taking risks. He was drawn to frontiers and places of volatile action. That's where he thought he felt most alive. I remember, in his memoir, he talks about coming under gunfire for the first time when he was 10 years old in California. And most of us would think, I prefer not to have anybody shooting at me ever again. And Burnham says it was thrilling and it influenced my entire career. So he had that in him since he was a boy, and also, of course, income. So he's restless. He's looking for historical action, risk. He's looking for prospects. He's looking for money, and it just kept his feet on fire, and he kept moving until he could find satisfaction in all those different areas.
I'm curious, Steve, after researching and writing about Burnham, I mean, is there anything about his life that inspired you to change yours a bit, like model your life a little bit after Burnham's?
I've been a freelance writer for over 30 years, so I have that riskiness, I guess. What this really did was allow me to not only revisit my boyhood, but then to think about it and to think about American history in a much more complicated way than I was able to do when I was 10 and riding on the range in my backyard, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So it gave me deep pleasure to read and to write about all these mountain men, the Apaches, the soldiers, the prospectors, and the miners, and but then also to bring to it a vast awareness of how these things happened and why they happened, and which parts of them are appalling, which parts are admirable, because it's all America. It's how we got where we are, and if we don't understand that, we're not going to move ahead. I mean, Burnham was against immigration, and look at him. He went to Africa to start over as an immigrant.
Right.
His ancestors came to America to start over as immigrants, and he was against Mexican immigration after growing up in Los Angeles. This makes sense. And then you look at our presidential candidates, two of whom were the sons of immigrants, and they were running on an anti-immigration platform. These things, they keep popping up. The racial stuff, the stuff about immigration, the stuff about military might, what should we do, and what is our place in the world? It all keeps popping up, and it's very rich material, especially if you come to it with some knowledge of what came before.
And yeah, you can get that knowledge by reading about the life of Burnham, because he lived it all.
Mm.
Well, Steve, this has been a great discussion. Literally, we scratched the surface, and we skipped, as you said, we skipped over parts of his life, his exploits in the Klondike, in Mexico. So where can people find out more about your book and your work?
Well, I have a website. It's www.stevekemper.net, and there's some information about Burnham in the book there. You can read the prologue to the book on the website. Or you can go to your local bookstore or an online bookstore, and you can find the book and buy it and read it. I hope that you'll enjoy it.
Yeah. Well, Steve Kemper, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Sure has. Thank you.
My guest today was Steve Kemper. He's the author of the book, A Splendid Savage, The Restless Life of Frederick Russell Burnham. And you can find that on Amazon.com and bookstores everywhere. And really go out and get it. It is a fascinating story. Some of them are unbelievable, but they all happened. Go check that out on Amazon.com. And for show notes for this show, after you're done listening, check out aom.is/Kemper.